March 4, 1944. 730 American heavy bombers approach Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich. Luftwaffe fighter controllers watch their radar screens with growing confidence. They know what's about to happen. They've seen it before. The American escort fighters will turn back soon. They always do. Out of fuel, out of range, out of luck. Then the bombers will be alone. Vulnerable. Easy prey. But on this day, something is different. The American fighters, they're not turning back. They keep coming, all the way to Berlin. And the Luftwaffe pilots can't believe what they're seeing.
Von German Pilotradios in Disbelief, amerikanische Jäger über Berlin.
American fighters over Berlin. It was impossible. Fighter escorts couldn't reach Berlin. Every expert said so. The laws of physics said so. The math didn't work. But there they were. North American P-51 Mustangs. With a simple aluminum innovation dangling beneath their wings that would change the air war forever. Today, we're uncovering how a disposable fuel tank, something the Luftwaffe knew about but fatally underestimated, shattered the myth that Germany's industrial heart was untouchable, and turned America's bomber offensive from a costly gamble into an unstoppable force. To understand why drop tanks changed everything, we need to go back to 1943, when the American 8th Air Force faced what seemed like an unsolvable problem. The strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany was bleeding to death. American doctrine centered on daylight precision bombing. Unlike the British, who bombed at night and saturated entire cities, the Americans believed they could strike specific targets: ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, aircraft plants, with pinpoint accuracy in broad daylight. The theory was beautiful. The reality was brutal. Without fighter escort deep into Germany, American bomber formations were being massacred. On October 14, 1943, a day that would become known as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses to bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. 60 bombers didn't come back. 60 out of 291. A 20% loss rate in a single mission. Another 138 B-17s were damaged. Many so badly they'd never fly again. Over 600 American airmen were dead, missing, or captured. This wasn't sustainable. At this rate, the 8th Air Force would destroy itself before it could destroy Germany. The Americans had fighters. Good fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a beast. 8.50 caliber machine guns, could take incredible punishment, and could hold its own against anything the Luftwaffe threw at it. But the P-47 had one fatal flaw: range. With internal fuel only, a P-47 could escort bombers about 175 miles into Germany before it had to turn back. That barely got the bombers past the German border. The really valuable targets: Berlin, the industrial Ruhr Valley, the aircraft factories in Leipzig and Regensburg, all were beyond reach. The Luftwaffe knew this. They'd done the math. German fighter controllers developed a brutal but effective strategy. Ignore the bombers while American escorts were present. Wait for the escorts to turn back due to fuel exhaustion. Then strike with overwhelming force. Luftwaffe fighters would form up just beyond the P-47's maximum range, engines idling, waiting. German pilots called it the waiting game. They'd watch the American escorts peel away, wings waggling in apology to the bomber crews. Then the Luftwaffe would pounce. And the slaughter would begin. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was confident. In late 1943, he told his commanders, "The Americans have courage, I'll give them that. But courage without escort is just a slow form of suicide. Their bombers will never reach Berlin in meaningful numbers. The fighters cannot reach that far. It's physically impossible." Göring was wrong, but he was also almost right. The fighter escort crisis. American bomber crews called the deepest parts of their missions going naked, flying without fighter protection. And they paid for it in blood. Consider the mission profile for a typical raid on Berlin. The round trip was over 1,100 miles. A P-47 Thunderbolt, even with a belly drop tank, maxed out at about 475 miles escort radius. That meant turning back while still 550 miles from Berlin. The P-38 Lightning had better range, about 520 miles with drop tanks, but it was needed in other theaters, and it had performance issues at high altitude over Europe. Even the new P-51 Mustang, which everyone agreed was a magnificent fighter aircraft, could only escort bombers about 400 miles into Germany with its internal 184 gallons of fuel. Better than the P-47, but still not enough to reach Berlin. The math was brutal and simple. No fighter of 1943 had the internal fuel capacity to fly 100-plus miles, engage in combat, and return home. 8th Air Force Commander General Ira Eaker faced a terrible choice: continue the daylight bombing campaign and accept catastrophic losses, or admit the doctrine had failed. In August 1943, losses were running at 10% per mission. In practical terms, this meant that a bomber crew's statistical survival odds of completing a 25-mission tour were essentially zero. Something had to change. And the solution was so simple it seemed almost absurd: hang more fuel tanks on the fighters. Fuel tanks you could throw away when empty or when combat started. Drop tanks. External fuel tanks. The Germans called them Abwurftanks. The British called them jettisonable tanks. The Americans would call them the key to winning the air war over Europe. The drop tank solution. Here's what's fascinating. Drop tanks weren't new technology. Not even close. The Germans had used them in the Battle of Britain in 1940. The Bf-109E fighters carried a 300-liter drop tank to extend their range over England. But they were unreliable, prone to leaking, and the Luftwaffe pilots often jettisoned them before even reaching England because they affected the aircraft's handling. The Japanese had drop tanks on their Zero fighters at Pearl Harbor. In fact, the Zero's incredible range, which shocked American intelligence, was partly due to their use of external tanks. Even the Americans had been experimenting with drop tanks since the 1920s. The principle was understood. Carry extra fuel externally, feed it to the engine first, then drop the empty tank to restore the aircraft's performance before combat. So why hadn't this solved the escort problem earlier? Because there's a massive difference between having drop tanks and having drop tanks that actually worked at scale in combat in the brutal conditions of 1944. The challenge wasn't just making a tank that held fuel. The challenge was making a tank that could be produced by the tens of thousands, wouldn't fail in sub-zero temperatures at 25,000 feet, could be jettisoned cleanly without damaging the aircraft, wouldn't affect the fighter's combat performance too badly while attached, could be filled quickly on the ground, was cheap enough to throw away after a single use, and most critically, could feed fuel reliably to the engine at high altitude, engineering the solution. In 1943, American engineers attacked the drop tank problem from multiple angles. The British had already developed pressed paper drop tanks, essentially laminated paper and glue formed under pressure. Cheap, disposable, reasonably effective. The Americans began producing these under license. But paper tanks had limitations. They could leak. In humid conditions, they could absorb moisture and fall apart. And they had a nasty tendency to catch fire if hit by even a single bullet. American engineers wanted something better. By late 1943, they developed stamped aluminum drop tanks. These were more expensive, about $40 per tank compared to $5 for paper, but they were reliable, could withstand temperature extremes, and most critically, they could be produced in massive quantities using the same stamping processes that made millions of other aluminum parts. The standard load-out became P-51 Mustang, two 108-gallon drop tanks, one under each wing, or one 110-gallon centerline tank, P-47 Thunderbolt, one 108-gallon belly tank, or later, two 108-gallon wing tanks, P-38 Lightning, two 165-gallon drop tanks. Let's do the math on what this meant for AP-51 Mustang. Internal fuel, 184 gallons. Two 108-gallon drop tanks, 216 gallons. Total, 400 gallons. The P-51's Packard Merlin engine burned about 70 gallons per hour at cruise settings. With 400 gallons, that gave the Mustang over 5.5 hours of flight time. At a cruise speed of 275 miles per hour, that's over 1,500 miles of range. More than enough to reach Berlin 575 miles from England and return, with fuel to spare for combat. The physics worked. The engineering worked. Now they just needed to prove it in combat. By early 1944, American factories were producing drop tanks at an astonishing rate. Multiple manufacturers were involved. Cleveland Pneumatic Tool Company, A.O. Smith Corporation, U.S. Rubber Company, for self-sealing components. By March 1944, production reached over 25,000 drop tanks per month. By D-Day in June 1944, monthly production exceeded 40,000 units. Think about what this meant logistically. Every P-51 mission to Berlin might use 2 drop tanks per aircraft. A typical mission might involve 200-plus Mustangs. That's 400-plus drop tanks dropped over Germany in a single day. And the Americans didn't care. They were disposable. Use once and throw away. Build more. This was the American way of war, industrial abundance solving tactical problems. German logistics officers who examined captured drop tanks were stunned. These were quality aluminum products, machined to precise tolerances, and the Americans were using them once and throwing them away. A Luftwaffe technical report from March 1944 noted, "The enemy's industrial capacity allows them to treat precision-manufactured fuel tanks as disposable items. This indicates a level of production capacity we cannot match." The Germans were still trying to make their drop tanks reusable, recoverable, worth saving. The Americans treated them like ammunition, consumable, expendable, produced in unlimited quantities. But production was only half the battle. The tanks still had to work at 25,000 feet, in temperatures of -40 degrees Fahrenheit, with fighters pulling high-G maneuvers. And that's where the real engineering came in. Making drop tanks work reliably at combat altitudes was far harder than it looked. Challenge 1. Fuel feed at altitude. At 25,000 feet, air pressure is about 1/3 of sea level pressure. Without proper venting and pressurization, fuel simply wouldn't flow from the external tank into the engine. The solution was a pressure relief valve system that maintained proper pressure differential between the tank and the fuel lines. Challenge 2. Temperature. At altitude, temperatures could drop to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel could become too viscous to flow, seals could freeze and crack, and metal could contract and leak. Engineers developed fuel additives and seal materials that remained flexible in extreme cold. Challenge 3. Clean separation. When a pilot hit the drop tank release, the tanks needed to fall away cleanly, without tumbling back into the tail or wings. This required careful aerodynamic design and spring-loaded release mechanisms. Early tanks occasionally damaged aircraft when released. By 1944, the system was refined and reliable. Challenge 4. Combat jettison. If a pilot encountered enemy fighters while still carrying drop tanks, he needed to jettison them immediately. The extra weight and drag made the aircraft less maneuverable. The release had to work instantly, every time, even under high-G loads. By January 1944, these problems were solved. The drop tank system was mature, reliable, and ready for mass deployment. All that remained was to prove it could change the war. The first missions to Berlin. March 3, 1944. The 8th Air Force plans its first major raid on Berlin with long-range fighter escort. The mission called for 502 heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators to strike Berlin's industrial suburbs. The primary targets were the Erkner ball bearing works and the Daimler-Benz tank engine factory. But more important than the bombing was the escort. For the first time, P-51 Mustangs would attempt to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The 4th Fighter Group, flying from Debden, England, would lead the way. These were experienced pilots, many of them former Eagle Squadron veterans who'd fought in the Battle of Britain. But they'd never attempted anything like this. The mission brief was straightforward. Take off, form up, link up with the bomber stream, and stay with them all the way to Berlin. Each P-51 carried 2 108-gallon drop tanks, 216 gallons of external fuel. The pilots were skeptical. Lieutenant Donald Blakesley, one of the 4th Fighter Group's top aces, reportedly said, "They're asking us to fly 1,200 miles round trip at altitude in winter weather and still have enough fuel to fight? This is either genius or suicide." The weather was terrible. Dense cloud cover over England. Icing conditions. Several fighter groups couldn't take off at all due to fog. But the 4th Fighter Group launched. 41 P-51s climbed through the clouds, formed up over the North Sea, and headed east toward Germany. Each pilot watched his fuel gauges nervously. They'd been briefed on fuel consumption rates, optimal cruise settings, when to switch from drop tanks to internal fuel. But this was theory. Now they'd find out if it worked in practice. The bomber stream stretched for miles, over 500 4-engine bombers in tight combat box formations, their contrails painting white lines across the sky. The P-51s weaved above and beside them, flying escort pattern. The drop tanks hung beneath their wings like fat silver sausages. As they crossed the German border, the radio chatter picked up. Luftwaffe controllers were tracking them, vectoring fighters to intercept. But something was different this time. Usually by this point, about 200 miles into Germany, the American escorts would be turning back, low on fuel. The Luftwaffe would be forming up, preparing to strike. But today, the Mustangs weren't turning back. German fighter controllers watched their radar plots with growing confusion. The escort blips weren't peeling away. They were still there, getting closer. At about 250 miles in, the P-51 pilots switched from external drop tanks to internal fuel, just as briefed. The drop tanks still had fuel in them. You switched before they were empty, to ensure continuous fuel flow, but they'd served their purpose, extending the range by precious miles. On command, pilots hit the drop tank release. 41 pairs of aluminum tanks fell away, tumbling toward the German countryside below. The Mustangs leapt forward, suddenly freed of their burden. Acceleration improved. Maneuverability returned. And critically, they still had full internal tanks. The pilots checked their fuel gauges. Still good. They could go farther. They kept flying east, toward Berlin. March 3, 1944, 1:15 p.m. local time. The first P-51 Mustangs reach Berlin. Captain Don Gentile, one of the 4th Fighter Group's leading aces, spotted the city first. The cloud cover had broken. There, spread out below, was the German capital. And rising to meet them were Luftwaffe fighters. Lots of them. FW-190s from Jägerschwader 1. Bf-109s from Jägerschwader 11. Over 100 German fighters scrambled to defend the Reich capital. But the German pilots were expecting easy prey, unescorted bombers, vulnerable and slow. What they got instead was a swarm of P-51 Mustangs, fresh from dropping their external tanks, ready for combat. The sky over Berlin erupted in a massive dogfight. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, a Luftwaffe ace with over 30 kills, was flying that day. His account, recorded in his diary, captures the German shock. March 3rd, American fighters over Berlin. This is a disaster. I engaged a Mustang south of the city. Fast, maneuverable at full power. How do they have fuel for combat after flying from England? I broke off the engagement, low on fuel myself. Our controllers assured us the escorts couldn't reach Berlin. They were wrong. The implications were staggering. If American fighters could reach Berlin, nowhere in Germany was safe. Not the aircraft factories, not the oil refineries, not the ball-bearing plants, not even Hitler's bunker beneath the Chancellery. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was immediate and devastating. The March 3rd mission wasn't an unqualified success. Bad weather forced most of the bomber force to hit secondary targets, and 9 bombers were lost. But the fighters had proven the concept. P-51s had reached Berlin. They'd fought over the German capital, and most had returned home safely. The 4th Fighter Group claimed 5 German fighters destroyed over Berlin. Even more importantly, they'd lost 0 Mustangs to fuel exhaustion. The drop tank system worked. March 4th, the 8th Air Force tried again. This time, 730 bombers and 644 escort fighters, including over 100 P-51s with drop tanks. The results were definitive. The P-51s reached Berlin, engaged German fighters throughout the mission, and escorted the bombers all the way back to the coast. Bomber losses dropped to 6.9%, still painful, but far better than the 20% loss rates of unescorted missions. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard, flying a P-51, single-handedly fought off over 30 German fighters attacking a bomber formation near Berlin. He'd later receive the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to earn it. But the real story was told in the fuel gauges. After the mission, ground crews checked the returning P-51s. Most landed with 20 to 30 gallons remaining, enough for 15 to 20 minutes of flight. Tight margins, but sufficient. The missions continued. March 6th, March 8th, March 9th. Each time, P-51s with drop tanks reached Berlin. By mid-March 1944, the Luftwaffe High Command had to accept a new reality. American fighters could reach anywhere in Germany. The defensive strategy that had worked in 1943, waiting for escorts to turn back, was obsolete. The drop tank had broken the strategic deadlock. The Luftwaffe's response. The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy had been built around geography and fuel mathematics. And overnight, both had changed. Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm of the Luftwaffe and one of Germany's top aces, understood immediately what this meant. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "The arrival of Mustangs over Berlin spelled the end of German air superiority. We could no longer husband our forces, waiting for the escorts to turn back. The escorts never turned back. Every raid, from takeoff to landing, was contested. Our pilots were flying for 5 sorties a day, constantly outnumbered, constantly engaged. It was unsustainable. The numbers tell the story." In February 1944, before P-51s with drop tanks regularly escorted to Berlin, the 8th Air Force lost 226 bombers, about 6.2% loss rate. By May 1944, with P-51 escorts standard on deep penetration missions, bomber losses dropped to 3.2% despite increased mission frequency. The Luftwaffe's loss rate, however, skyrocketed. In February 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 355 fighters. In March, 536 fighters. In April, 489 fighters. This wasn't just attrition. This was unsustainable hemorrhaging. The Luftwaffe was being bled white over their own territory. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. German fighter controllers developed new tactics. First, they tried to catch the P-51s before they dropped their tanks. A Mustang with drop tanks was less maneuverable. If they could force combat while the Americans still carried the external tanks, they might gain an advantage. But American pilots were trained. If bounced while carrying tanks, jettison immediately. The tactic failed. Second, the Germans tried massed formations. Instead of attacking in small groups that could be overwhelmed by escorting fighters, they'd mass 50 to 100 fighters and punch through the escort screen in a single overwhelming strike. This worked, occasionally, but it required perfect coordination and timing. And it meant concentrating fighters from across Germany, leaving other areas undefended. The Americans simply sent raids to multiple targets simultaneously, forcing the Luftwaffe to disperse their forces. Third, the Germans tried to attack while the Americans were low on fuel during the return trip. The logic was sound even with drop tanks. AP-51 that had flown to Berlin and engaged in combat would be getting low on fuel on the way home. But American mission planners had thought of this. They staged the Escort in waves. Fresh P-51s with full drop tanks would meet the bombers on the return leg, spelling the earlier Escorts. The bombers were never without protection. The Luftwaffe was out of options. There was no tactical solution to a strategic problem. They were outnumbered, and now they were outranged. German pilot accounts from spring 1944 reveal growing desperation and disbelief. Oberfeldwebel Hans Berger, a Bf-109 pilot, wrote in April 1944, took off at 0900 to intercept American bombers near Leipzig. We were told the escorts would turn back before we engaged. At 11:30, engaged bomber formation. American Mustangs everywhere. Fought for 20 minutes. Low on fuel, had to break off. Landed at 12:15. Refueled. Took off again at 13:30. Same thing, Mustangs over every bomber formation. How do they have fuel for this? How do they have so many aircraft? Hauptmann Emil Lang, a Luftwaffe ace with over 170 victories, was shot down and killed by AP-51 over Leipzig in September 1944. His final radio transmission, recorded by his wingman. They're everywhere. I can't shake him. Where did they get the fuel to? Then silence. The psychological impact was devastating. German pilots were fighting over their own homeland with friendly airfields below, and they were running out of fuel before the Americans. Lieutenant Heinz Nock wrote in his diary in May 1944, "The war is lost. I don't mean the war on the ground. The invasion hasn't even started. I mean the air war. It's already over. The Americans can go anywhere they want, whenever they want, with fighter escort. We can't stop them. Our production facilities are being destroyed. Our fuel reserves are being bombed. And all the while, American fighters circle overhead, daring us to come up and fight. The drop tanks, those simple aluminum tanks they throw away like trash. They've beaten us. Not through superior skill, our pilots are as good as theirs. Not through better aircraft, our 109s and 190s can match a Mustang. But through simple, brutal logistics, they can fight over Berlin. We can barely reach our own assembly points before we have to worry about fuel. How do you fight an enemy who can throw away precision-manufactured fuel tanks without a second thought? The strategic impact. With the range problem solved, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, February 20th to 25th, 1944. 6 days of maximum effort bombing against German aircraft production facilities. Nearly 3,000 heavy bomber sorties, all with long-range fighter escort thanks to drop tanks. The Americans lost 137 bombers, painful, but sustainable. The Luftwaffe lost over 450 fighters and, critically, many of their most experienced pilots. But the real damage was to German production. The raids hit aircraft assembly plants at Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Schweinfurt. German fighter production dropped by an estimated 25% in March 1944. And this was just the beginning. With P-51s now able to escort bombers anywhere in Germany, the American strategic bombing campaign shifted into high gear. April 1944. Raids on synthetic oil plants at Luna, Merseburg, Politz. These plants produced 90% of Germany's aviation gasoline. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe's remaining fighters were grounded. May 1944. Systematic attacks on German transportation networks. Rail yards, bridges, marshalling yards. The goal wasn't just to damage Germany's war economy. It was to isolate the invasion beaches before D-Day. Every mission, P-51s with drop tanks provided escort. Bomber losses dropped to around 3% per mission, still dangerous but sustainable. Young bomber crews now had a realistic chance of surviving their 25 mission tours. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was being destroyed in a war of attrition it couldn't win. By June 6, 1944 D-Day, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The German Air Force managed to fly exactly 319 sorties over the Normandy beaches on D-Day. Total, the Allies flew 14,674 sorties. Over 3,000 of those were American fighters P-51s, P-47s, P-38s, many equipped with drop tanks that allowed them to patrol over the beaches for extended periods. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel inspected the Atlantic Wall defenses before D-Day, his officers asked when the Luftwaffe would provide air cover. Rommel's response, according to his aide, was bitter. The Luftwaffe? They can't even defend Berlin. Don't count on seeing them in Normandy. He was right. German ground forces in Normandy fought under constant Allied air attack. The Luftwaffe was essentially absent, and this air superiority was made possible in large part by something as simple as external fuel tanks. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, said after the war, "When historians analyze the factors that led to Allied victory in Europe, they'll point to many things: industrial production, Soviet sacrifice, British resilience. But I'll tell you what changed the air war. It was the day our fighters could go anywhere in Germany and come home. After that, we owned the sky. And once you own the sky, you win the war." Let's talk numbers, because the economics of drop tanks reveal something profound about American strategy. A single pressed paper drop tank cost about $5 to manufacture. An aluminum drop tank cost about $40. P-51 Mustang cost approximately $51,000 to build. A B-17 Flying Fortress cost about $238,000. Training a bomber crew, 10 men with months of training, represented an investment of hundreds of thousands of dollars, not to mention the irreplaceable human cost. On an unescorted mission to Berlin in 1943, you might lose 15 to 20 bombers. That's $3.50 to $4.70 million in aircraft losses alone, plus 150 to 200 trained airmen. On an escorted mission with drop tanks in 1944, you might lose 2 to 3 bombers. That's $500,000 to $700,000 in losses. The drop tanks to escort that mission? Maybe 400 tanks at $40 each. That's $16,000. For a $16,000 investment in throwaway fuel tanks, you saved $3 million in bombers and 100+ lives per mission. This is the American way of war in a nutshell. Spend resources to save lives. Use industrial capacity to gain tactical advantage. Treat material as disposable if it helps accomplish the mission. The Germans never fully grasped this mindset. They were still trying to recover and reuse drop tanks. They were rationing fuel, rationing ammunition, rationing everything. The Americans were dropping tens of thousands of aluminum tanks over Germany and building more the next day. It wasn't fair. It wasn't a fair fight. And that was exactly the point. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer an effective fighting force. In September 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 978 aircraft. In October, another 818. These weren't sustainable losses. German factories couldn't produce replacements fast enough, and even more critically, they couldn't train replacement pilots fast enough. German fighter pilot training had dropped from 260 flight hours in 1942 to just 110 hours by late 1944. American pilots averaged 400+ hours before their first combat mission. Inexperienced German pilots, flying outdated tactics, in aircraft that were often low on fuel, faced experienced American pilots in superior aircraft with unlimited fuel and ammunition. The result was predictable. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe was largely grounded, not from lack of aircraft, but from lack of fuel. The synthetic oil plants that P-51s had helped destroy in 1944 never recovered production. General Adolf Galland made one last desperate attempt to reverse the tide, Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields on New Year's Day, 1945. The Luftwaffe threw 900 fighters at Allied bases, achieving tactical surprise. They destroyed about 300 Allied aircraft on the ground, but they lost 271 fighters in the attack, and more critically, they lost over 200 experienced pilots, men they couldn't replace. It was the Luftwaffe's last gasp. After January 1945, German fighters rarely challenged American bombers. The sky belonged to the Allies, and it had been decided, in large part, by the ability of American fighters to reach anywhere in Germany and return home safely. Thanks to drop tanks. The legacy. After the war, military analysts on both sides tried to identify the turning points, the moments when the outcome became inevitable. The Battle of Britain in 1940. Pearl Harbor in 1941. Stalingrad in 1943. D-Day in 1944. But for the air war over Europe, many historians point to a quieter moment. March 1944, when P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks first escorted bombers to Berlin and back. That was the moment the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy collapsed. That was the moment German industry became vulnerable. That was the moment the outcome of the air war became inevitable. Albert Speer, Nazi Germany's Minister of Armaments and War Production, said in his interrogation after the war, "The American campaign against our synthetic oil production in 1944 was decisive. Once they could escort bombers to any target in Germany, our fate was sealed. We couldn't defend everything. We couldn't rebuild fast enough. The drop tank solved the Americans' range problem, and once that was solved, we had no answer." German General Heinz Guderian was more blunt. The war was lost in the air before it was lost on the ground. The drop tank seems like such a simple solution in retrospect. Just add more fuel. Make it detachable. Throw it away when you're done. But simple solutions to complex problems are often the hardest to implement. It required engineering excellence to make tanks that worked reliably, industrial capacity to mass-produce them, tactical doctrine to employ them effectively, strategic vision to prioritize their development, and perhaps most importantly, a mindset that valued mission success over resource conservation. The drop tank concept would become standard for virtually every military aircraft that followed. From Korea to Vietnam to the Gulf War to today, external fuel tanks extend the range of fighters, allowing them to project power across vast distances. Modern F-15s, F-16s, F divided by a -18s, all carry drop tanks as standard equipment. The principle remains unchanged. Carry extra fuel externally, jettison when necessary, extend your operational range. The innovation wasn't the idea itself. The innovation was making it work at scale under pressure when it mattered most.